All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We are so happy to have you here today. My name is Becca Phillips. I am the Climate and Health Fellow here at PSR National, and I oversee the Next Generation Ambassador Program. Our Next Generation Ambassadors are medical and health students and emerging health professionals. And this training was actually originally created for our Next Generation Ambassadors, but we are so happy to be able to open up to the wider PSR community, and we're really excited to have you here today. So I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Lise Van Susteren. I'm also trying to let people in, so trying to do both at once. So Dr. Lise Van Susteren is a general and forensic psychiatrist in Washington, D.C., and an expert on the physical and mental health effects of climate change. In 2011, she co-authored The Psychological Effects of Global Warming on the U.S., Why the U.S. Mental Health System is Not Prepared. In addition to community organizing on climate issues, Van Susteren serves on the boards of Earth Day Network, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and is a co-founder of Climate Psychiatry Alliance, a group dedicated to promoting awareness and action on climate from a mental health perspective. She is the expert witness on the psychological damages to young people from climate disruption in Juliana versus US. In 2006, Dr. Van Susteren sought the Democratic nomination to the US Senate from Maryland. She is a frequent contributor to television, radio, and in the print media. Her book, Emotional Inflammation, Discover Your Triggers and Reclaim Your Equilibrium During Anxious Times, was published in April 2020. We're so happy to have you here. And just before we get started, we'll be taking questions at the very end. I know that Dr. Van Susteren really loves when people interrupt and take questions, but because of time, we're just going to wait till the end, and I'll allow you to take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Becca. Thanks everybody for being here. We're all kindred spirits. So I have three main, well, that's not a very auspicious beginning. Are we sure that I have, okay.
You can see it.
Okay, good. All right. So I have three main goals. Can you see this entire slide? Yes, I hope so. First of all, is to share hard data on the mental health toll of the climate crisis. But above all, it's to stir empathy in us, because we want to drive home that however uncomfortable our emotions, troubling emotions are unavoidable if we're telling the truth. Furthermore, a lot of energy is embedded in these emotions, and our job is to capture that energy and redirect into action. So the presentation has three parts. I always like to know where we're going. The first part is the overview, is where we will flesh out the emotional toll and identify the impacts that carry the heaviest psychological burden. Part two is on messaging and denial, which will include surprising info about what promotes behavior change that sticks. Part three is all about action, building a climate action plan that's right for you. Well, I'm sick of hearing the term, and maybe you will be soon enough, that talking frankly about the climate crisis is equated with being all doom and gloom. No, talking frankly about the climate crisis puts us in a position to deal with reality and make choices about life and death situations while we still have time. I will recount an event that everyone is likely to identify with in some ways, but maybe especially medical professionals. Although it would be medical practice now, doctors, as you may know, used to hide life-threatening diagnoses from their patients to protect them, they would say. But it was also, of course, perhaps unconsciously, to protect themselves from having to deal with the emotions. I remember it vividly. I was a medical student in France at the then named Hôpital Cochin. A middle-aged woman with a history of breast cancer was hospitalized for back pain. The pain was from metastases that had gone to her spine. On rounds in the hallway, the attending let us know that he was not going to tell her it was from the breast cancer, but rather he was going to say it was sciatica, so she wouldn't be so upset. On what seemed like the count of three, we swept into her room. She straightened upright in her bed, and the attending, peering into her Pardon me? Oh, peering into her chart, began paging through it, and then commented about her sciatica. Exhaling deeply, she slumped back into her pillow, murmuring that she felt so relieved. À cause de mon histoire, she said, because of my history. I have often wondered what went through her mind when she realized the truth, and what important choices she might have made been different, knowing the reality, before it was too late. I say this to make the point. The public needs to know the dangers of the climate crisis. The truth needs to be told so we can take appropriate emergency action. People like us are critical because we play an outsized role in sounding the alarm and driving home the urgency of the need for action. We have an obligation to deliver these messages because we are trained and trusted members of the community. In with that comes the moral duty to warn and protect. As we ponder what we must do to answer the call to action and how to pierce the distancing from the crisis that some people engage in, I'm going to ask you to think about this. What is the nature of ethical behavior? Where does it come from? Laws, religion, what society says? All three? None of the above? As friend Gary Cohen of Healthcare Without Harm says, you can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. I apologize, I thought I had that covered. By the way, don't bother to take notes. I will give you a copy of all of this text and the images at the end. So everything related to climate instability, all the losses, injuries, illnesses, and displacement from extreme weather events, storms, floods, fires, heat waves, and the slower moving chronic and indirect impacts from sea level rise, droughts, ocean acidification, poor air quality, the spread of disease, and problems with food and water, mass migrations, and all the geopolitical ramifications carry with them an attendant emotional toll. As the grip of social and intergenerational injustice from inaction on climate tightens, our success in driving change turns on a defining human capacity, our ability to stir empathy, because emotional connection is at the heart of what gets people to change. Consider, when the place you call home is burned down, blown away, dried up, flooded, when you lose your possessions, maybe your pets, your livelihood, your community, you see injuries, illness, and death, the mix of fear, anger, sorrow, and trauma can easily drive a person to the breaking point. After extreme weather events, mental health professionals are seeing surging numbers of people struggling with PTSD, major depression, and anxiety disorder. We've seen rising drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, which includes child abuse. Many among us do not fully understand the urgency with which we need to act. Climate change can be abrupt, not just slow and incremental. Breakaway impacts can occur in a matter of decades or years. The state of the Earth's climate is driven by 5 interacting complex systems: air, water, ice and permafrost, our rocky surface, and the biosphere. They are subject to natural changes or forces, but at the hands of humans, they become unnatural external forcings capable of triggering tipping points, which can drive unstoppable apocalyptic alterations in the conditions of our planet. I will cite only a few of Earth's systems nearing those tipping points. If you wish to know more, material will be in a chapter I wrote for an online book on climate and mental health that will be available soon, or you can email me for it. We are nearing temperatures from anthropogenic greenhouse gases that trigger those tipping points. It warrants declaring a planet-wide climate emergency. Some examples: diminishing ice. Bright white ice reflects the sun's energy and heat waves, that's the albedo effect, bouncing it back to outer space where the heat is lost. This is what happens when the ice is gone. The dark ocean water or other dark surfaces absorb that heat. This results in sea level rise. The West Antarctic ice sheet, many scientists believe, has begun an irreversible melt. You heard that. Sea level rise of 10 to 15 feet as early as 2060 is possible. And I verified this with Jim Hansen. The thermohaline conveyor belt. Think of it as going round and round. Colder, saltier water is heavier than warmer, less salty water. The current that encircles the globe drives much of our weather and climate. Under normal conditions, as it moves across the equator, hot temperatures cause evaporation, increasing the salinity. And as it moves northward, it continues to cool. But under abnormal conditions, a rapid melting of fresh water from Greenland's glaciers, in addition to raising sea level, is reducing the salinity, causing the current to slow. Scientists are deeply anxious because the current has already become destabilized and slowed maybe as much as 20%. A shutdown could trigger disastrous upheavals in weather and climate all across the globe. The thermohaline conveyor belt also delivers nutrients along its pathway. An alteration in the delivery of the supply chain dramatically affects marine life. Collapse of the oceans. As excessive atmospheric CO2 dissolves in the ocean is becoming increasingly acidic. Overfishing and warming play a role, but the continued breakdown of coral reefs and shell-bearing marine in these acidic conditions and resulting decimations of marine life is causing fear of a collapse of the oceans. 3 out of 5 marine organisms depend at some point in their evolution on coral reefs. For 2 billion people, marine life is the primary source of protein. Others depend on it for financial survival. Extinction and biodiversity loss. By the way, these last very excellent slides, I am grateful to former Vice President Gore for. Extinction rates are 1,000 times higher than base rate. As many as 50% of all species will be on a path to extinction, as many as may be on a path to extinction by mid-century. We have lost nearly 60% of our wildlife. Imagine that, in the last 40 years. And then there's the carbon bomb. As the tundra melts, previously frozen organic matter is decomposing. It's sort of like rotting meat in a broken freezer. It gives off CO2 and the even more initially potent greenhouse gas, methane. I want you to look at this video, and it's controversial, this carbon bomb, but the people who are defending their studies say that the people who are objecting to their studies should come up and have a look for themselves. So I'm going to play it so you can see.
We're out standing on a frozen lake in interior Alaska, outside of the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus. And this ice is already about 20 centimeters thick. So as it's been freezing up, methane gas has been coming out of the bottom of the lake and getting trapped in the lake ice. If you look at the shore, you can see that there are lots of trees that are falling in the lake and they're dying. What's happening is the permafrost is thawing. The ice that was in the ground, when it melts, causes the ground surface to collapse. Then the forest falls in, and any organic matter, dead plant and animal remains that were in the permafrost, thaw out in the bottom of the lake. Microbes decompose it, and it generates methane. And methane doesn't like to stay in water in solution. It forms bubbles, and those bubbles make their way to the surface.
Oops, I wanted to advance it a bit so you could see. The point is that you will see they're going to light these emerging
We're out standing.
gas. if I can find it.
the bubbles, and those bubbles. The winter, however,
There it
this
is.
ice forms a cover on the surface of the lake, and the bubbles get. So what we have out here is like a time-lapse photograph of methane emission. A very potent greenhouse gas, a multiple than carbon dioxide. Methane is formed in millions of lakes around the Arctic where permafrost is thawing. And each year, these lakes are emitting already tremendous amounts of methane. But when we look at how much carbon is in permafrost still frozen, and the potential for that permafrost to thaw in the future, we estimate that more than 10 times the amount of methane that's right now in the atmosphere will come out of these lakes.
Moving on to other tipping points, the flipping of the Amazon from a rainforest to a savanna. To remind you, the savanna is a flat area covered with grasses and few trees, usually found in hot, dry spots in Africa.
Cannot hear the moderator.
The longer, wetter monsoon seasons accounting for the dreadful recent flooding, for example, of over 1/3 of the country of Pakistan. Global warming is driving the increasing frequency and intensity, of course, of extreme weather events. It's been doubled since the early 1990s. And some of us are lucky enough to be at a distance from the world's climate disasters, but we're not potted plants sitting here. In empathic identification with the victims, it's painful seeing people drowned, burned, flooded, starved. And when disasters are no longer experienced solely as acts of God or nature, but derived from the behavior of humans, they're even more harmful because what happens from intentional negligence is harder to put behind us than what happens accidentally. Heat waves are the leading weather-related killer in the United States. They're 7 times the losses from floods. 9 of the top 10 hottest years ever occurred in the last decade. In July 19, 2021, Death Valley, California set a record at 130 degrees. And as someone wrote, a medium rare steak is cooked to an internal temperature of 130 degrees. Exactly the same. The Middle East is warming at twice the global average. Experts say without significant action, some cities in the Middle East will become uninhabitable before the end of the century. Let's look at direct effects. We have likely all experienced some physical impacts of light overheating. Heat stroke is a medical emergency. It can quickly lead to death. It happens when the body temperature keeps going up, but our ability to cool it down under these extreme circumstances isn't enough. It's really a horrible way to die. Organs shut down, the brain swells, cells die, literally baked to death. We know that the elderly, the sick, and the very young are at highest risk. Indirect effects: higher temperatures speed up the chemical reactions that form smog. Higher temperatures also favor stagnation of polluted air at ground level where we breathe it in. For each standard deviation of increased temperature and change in rainfall, we can expect a 4% increase in conflict between individuals and a 14% increase in conflict between groups. These findings are valid for all ethnicities and across every region of the world. An increase in assaults, murders, and suicides as temperatures go up and rainfall changes must come as no surprise. And while any suicide, I think we well know, is the result of complex forces, drought from persistent high temperatures is a cause. And we have seen that in the Indian farmers in India, in rural Australia, South Africa, and as you saw in the previous slide, in the US and Mexico. Let's look at a few selected chronic climate conditions. Drought. What despair comes from watching and waiting for rains that don't come? Drought forces migrations, and when water is scarce, conflict is right on its heels. The UN says by 2030, nearly half of everyone in the world, will be living in countries highly stressed for water. Sea level rise. Tens of millions of Americans live on coastlines. Worldwide, hundreds of millions live within 30 feet of sea level. Without a sharp reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, former NASA climate scientist Dr. James Hansen warns, we could see global 10 to 13 feet in as few as 50 years. Parts of our coastal cities would still be sticking above the water, he says, but you couldn't live there. Air pollution. The World Health Organization reports that 9 out of 10 people breathe unhealthy air. And again, I will give you these slides and the text. Air pollution is largely the result of burning fossil fuels. When coal, oil, and gas are burned, they create pollutants that undergo a chemical reaction and form clumps of gunk, I'll call it, particulate matter. Warmer temperatures speed up these chemical reactions, causing pollution to become denser. When we inhale particulate matter, it is drawn into the body. The focus is on 2.5 particulate matter, but check out what happens way over on the right of the slide where the real problem lies in ultrafine particulate matter, less than 0.1 microns. When we inhale, the ultrafine particulate matter, as this graph shows, is carried by the bloodstream throughout the entire body. The presence of the foreign material in our bodies triggers inflammation that can set us up for a multitude of illnesses and conditions, including cancers, respiratory illnesses, cardiovascular disease, permanent decreased lung volume in children, which is one reason why many well-to-do families are moving out of Beijing, and other conditions. It is also linked to dementia, including Alzheimer's type, and to other neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's disease and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Multiple lines of evidence support a link between neuroinflammation, inflammation of brain tissue, and classic psychiatric illnesses, major depressive disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorders. Polluted air reduces cognitive performance. It reduces our ability to think. Responding to crises, using information, planning strategy. And the pathway to get to our brain tissue is right through our noses. It crosses by hitching a ride on the olfactory nerve, which is in the nasal mucosa, and rides directly into the brain, where it causes the inflammatory response that brings about cell death. And then there are national security and geopolitical consequences. Boy, these unnerve me. Climate instability leads to social instability on a local level at first. Civic unrest, you see, with petty offenses is what kicks things off. But you may know that just the other day, or just a few weekends ago, police were arresting looters in Sanibel. Read what Governor DeSantis said. So social instability rises as the disruption widens. Climate disruption is a threat multiplier and also the root cause of destabilized regions. The worst drought in 900 years put hundreds of thousands of people on the road in search of safety in places that didn't want them and wouldn't help them. These displacements, extreme weather events, and the ensuing political tension cause people to be on the move. Their movement opens them up to illness and violence along the way, and they are infrequently welcome for the long haul in the place they land, which in the defense of the current residents is understandable since they're not prepared for the influx and are likely living on the edge of resources themselves. And the refugees. In contrast to the displaced who are within their own country or lands, refugees are seeking safety in new places where the culture, the language, and so much else is radically different. Many may not survive the journey. The humanitarian crises and resulting political polarization from the epic numbers of refugees will begin to dominate society globally. The flood of refugees has brought carnage, upheaval, and humanitarian crises at an unprecedented level, while driving up fears of the other that have resulted in a resurgence of fiery, divisive nationalism. It has fractured post-World War II coalitions, the European Union for one, and has strained democratic leadership. Meloni in Italy, Orban in Hungary, the popularity of Marie Le Pen in France, and of course, we know the troubles that we have seen here in the US. These are threats to democracy. For in times of peril and scarcity, we see a rise in authoritarian government because people turn to what they perceive as strong leaders to protect them. They may be willing to give up their freedom in exchange for the promise of perceived security. Heaven help us from the tyrants, the bullies, and I used to say could be unleashed, but now I have to say have been unleashed. As a former psychological profile of world leaders for the Central Intelligence Agency, I fear for our democratic way of life. Anti-American sentiment that recognize our disproportionate contribution to the climate crisis is rising. While representing 5% of the world's population, we have put up 25% of the greenhouse gases. How will we motivate other countries to embrace democracy? Or will another form of government look more attractive? Pakistan's prime minister said that Pakistan was paying the price for the West's use of fossil fuels. Abad. This is hard to hear from a man with so much blood on his hands, but papers swept up during the storm of bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad, and earlier letters show his focus on America's role in causing climate change. He wrote, "You have destroyed nature with your industrial waste and gases more than any other nation in history." Select impacts on ecosystems, I'm just going to call a few out. Look at this Mauritania, the capital of Mauritania on the west coast of Africa. You can see the encroaching desert. This is a sobering one for me, seeing what feels like such a huge rise in ALS. And that is that there are toxic substances in some of the algal blooms in waters, especially in the northeastern part of the US. BMAA is beta-methylamino L-alanine. You'll have this in the text that I give to you. It's cyanobacteria in blue-green algae, and it's linked to Alzheimer's, ALS, and Parkinson's. Biodiversity loss. You saw the graph earlier, but I'd like to say that in our fight for the climate, it has been said that we should think of people, not polar bears. A legitimate reminder that privileged groups overlook the environmental injustices affecting people in places where socioeconomic challenges and systemic racism impede the ability to be heard. But animals are central to our existence for many reasons, including supporting the intricate relationships of natural life critical to our survival. And regarding our relationship with animals, an error in translation, Hebrew scholars tell us that it isn't dominion over animals that was written in the ancient biblical texts, but rather that we have the grave responsibility to protect them. We risk personal and psychosocial damage, profound, as we stray from the ecosystems we were evolved to share with other species. Briefly, vector-borne and infectious diseases, just want to say that 70% of emerging diseases in humans are zoonotic. That means that they go from animals to people. They're passed from animals to humans, with an estimated 1.7 million more that we don't know about. Hunger. Our food supply is at risk. Climate change leads to food insecurity by reducing the amount and quality of the food that we can produce. Crops grown under elevated atmospheric CO2 concentrations contain less protein. These micronutrient deficiencies, magnesium and zinc, are in addition to protein, are linked to cognitive disorders, depression, behavioral disorders, and mental illness, and a host of other physical illnesses, conditions, and deaths. This is a photo of a child with kwashiorkor syndrome. When I was a doctor in Africa, I saw children die of kwashiorkor. It's due to a protein deficiency, and it is something that you never forget. The UN Environmental Program has declared that transitioning to a low-carbon, plant-based diet is the only way to save the world from hunger, from fuel shortages, and climate change. A global shift towards a vegan diet is becoming essential. Then there's emotional toll on special populations. Just selected a few: the elderly, the sick, the disabled, the mentally ill, the poor, those living in the bullseye of disaster-prone areas along coastlines and rivers, inner cities with the heat island effect, first responders. Then bombshell news. If you know someone struggling with infertility, or you yourself know how painful it is, sperm counts, you should know, in American, Australian, and European men have fallen by 50%. Infertility is a complex disorder, but exposure to an unhealthy environment is one cause. It's been dubbed environmental castration. But a new factor is in the mix. Infertility is linked to rising temperatures. The decline appears to be transgenerational. That is, that it's transmitted to future generations. Now, left out often of those especially vulnerable are the climate experts, and probably some of us, the activists, the climate Cassandras, who you may know who Cassandra was in Greek or rather Roman mythology. But in the grip of images of future disasters that these climate Cassandras can't get out of their minds, they're desperately issuing anguished warnings. And we can suffer with a version of the classic PTSD, which I have dubbed pre-traumatic stress condition. And I changed it to disorder because I think the disorder is climate disavowal or denial or minimization. So pre-traumatic stress condition. I'd like to play you a tape that I shot just a while, well, it's been some time now, of my friend Gillian Caldwell, who founded the group that was the predecessor to 350.org. Hear what she has to say.
Let me switch just a little bit to the personal toll that doing what you do every day has, hearing what you hear every day has on you.
Lisa, she's gonna get me crying no matter what. I think, there's that sense that no matter how hard you work, no matter how hard you try, you're living in a parallel universe where some people see it and some people get it, and most of us don't. And that is extremely upsetting because you can't be headed straight off a cliff and have everybody look around you and say, we don't have the votes to stop the car from heading off the cliff. That's what we get all the time. What you're describing is politically impossible. And what we're saying is, no, what you're describing is absolutely untenable because it's the end of life on planet Earth as we know it. That's what the scientists are telling us. Those are the facts. We're past the point of disinformation and misinformation. And the reality is that people are still asleep.
So this was shot actually in 2009. And we can talk more about that later. I'm going to skip over the section that I was going to talk to you on about kids. I think that Becca's already told you I'm the expert witness in two cases, Juliana versus the federal government, 21 youth plaintiffs and Jim Hansen suing for inaction on climate on constitutional grounds, and also in a case against the state of Montana, Held versus the state of Montana. 16 youth plaintiffs are suing the state of Montana for inaction on climate. What I would like to mention, though, is that a recent publication in a study that I was a co-author of was released last fall and was in The Lancet. And what it tells you is some interesting facts. Have a look about climate distress. 10,000 kids from 10 different countries around the world. 3/4 are afraid about the future. Nearly half say it affects their daily lives. More than half feel doomed, and 2/3 lay the blame squarely at the feet of government. Another thing to consider is that some of you may have heard, and of course, a lot of you have heard about people really conflicted about having children, and I'm not going to comment on that. I'll let you all comment on that. But there's also something that I would like to bring up, and that is what's called the ACEs risk. It's the adverse childhood experiences, which when children are exposed to threatening conditions, whether extreme weather events or any other type of trauma, or well, I should say trauma generally, which extreme weather events are no exception, the increase in morbidity and mortality can be lifelong, and it alters their brains. It alters their prefrontal cortex, which is the seat, of course, of our cognition, our thinking, how we judge, our judgment, our way we figure out stressful situations and find our sort of consciousness of moral issues. And also it affects our limbic system and our back brain, all of the things that govern how we react to stress. And again, these are lifelong consequences. And we know that there's what's called the transgenerational epigenetic inheritance of stress, which means that what the current generation is experiencing can be passed on through DNA that is awakened in utero to the next generation. So moving on, not everything that counts can be counted. There are downstream social dimensions of climate trauma that we can't even conjure or imagine, because it is the inchoate, insidious, complex, and unconscious psychological states driven by climate trauma that aren't necessarily lending themselves to studies and precise numbers, but they are the most profoundly damaging and drive systemic emotional conditions society will find difficult to treat and surmount. The emotional toll from climate trauma insinuates itself into every aspect of our lives, collectively affecting the national mood, shaping our culture in a way that drives our economy, our politics, the quality of life in our communities and families. Increasingly, it affects how we treat each other. Much of the violence in the world can be explained by unaddressed anxiety emanating from fears of impotence and vulnerability. Climate change evokes a profound sense of both. Moving on, we will get increasingly, now that I've described the problem, we will get increasingly into what we can do about it. So if you're unnerved, I think that's a realistic place to start, and we're going to capture that energy and redirect it into action. So part 2 is all about resistance and communication. Why in the world don't we throw ourselves into action knowing this stuff? Let's talk about understanding the psychology of inaction. Starting with, how can smart people deny or distance themselves from the reality of climate disruption? First, let's look at what individual psychology tells us. And that is that, moving on, right, sorry about that. Here's what individual psychology tells us: that we resist, deny, disavow, all of those, the D's, for money, because short-term profits are put ahead of our health. For power, politicians craving power come to mind in particular. To avoid losing face, if you said no before, the confirmation bias assures that it's much harder for us to change our minds because it means admitting we were wrong before. Feeling emasculated. Only girly men are afraid of the weather, for heaven's sake, right? And Mother Nature, no darn woman is going to push them around. You may be ostracized. Membership in a group often requires not challenging tightly held beliefs. Losing a feeling of security. Fearing the center cannot hold, to quote Yeats, that God could let the world and would simply have it fall apart can make people feel that they will fall apart. And there are deeper issues. Climate change is a veritable Pandora's box of dark thoughts. We are transient beings here, subject to the laws of physics. In the grand scheme of things, impermanent, vulnerable, not the masters of the universe we would like to imagine. As conditions worsen, evoking awful images of the future, including that civilization may not survive, the narrative of the climate crisis is a metaphor for our own insignificance, aging, and death. We strive to get those thoughts out of our minds, so we deny, disavow, and defy the science that reminds us. By the way, I haven't the slightest shred of a doubt that we are all suffering from climate anxiety, and not from climate anxiety, whether we know it or not, whether we accept it or not, whether we admit it or not. Aggression. Failing to confront the climate crisis when we know how much future generations are going to suffer as an explanation. It's aggression. Passive, active, conscious, unconscious. Boil out the qualifiers, aggression is there. How do we explain it? Revenge? Is it the ultimate narcissistic blow to be dead when they are alive? My colleagues and I would have no trouble calling this out in parents who, for example, would fail to write out a decent will so that their children who have a history of competitive relationships with each other are not protected. So do let me know if you want further information on that. I'd be delighted to discuss that further. And then there are dependency issues. We're waiting for the magic parent, technology, some genius, an impressive leader to come up with solutions that, as in an old cowboy movie, get there just in time. I gotta say, yesterday I saw the nuclear fusion and I thought, oh my God, there it is. And someone said it's going to be at least 25 years before we get there. I don't know if that's true, but we are all prone to thinking that there's going to be a magic bullet. And then entitlement. Well-off members of society sometimes rail at financial entitlements given to those on the lower end of the socioeconomic totem pole, but the entitlement that is the most unjust is the one rarely mentioned, leading a high carbon lifestyle. 10% of the world's richest emit 60% of the world's greenhouse gases. What does social psychology tell us? The bystander effect. In 1964, in New York City, 28-year-old Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death steps from her door. The report was that a crowd gathered but did nothing to stop the killer and didn't immediately call the police. It launched serious soul searching. Had the anonymity of the city and society generally become so detached that we were becoming indifferent to others' suffering? Darley and Latane, two social psychologists, studied the issue and described the bystander effect. Here's what they said. What's the effect of the crowd? When it comes to intervening in a crisis, they saw the larger the crowd, the less likely we are to act. Why? Diffusion of responsibility in a crowd, the influence of what people around you are doing. That's the social norms. No one else is taking action. Dependency issues. Somebody else will do it. And anonymity. No one knows me. The factors influencing, in contrast, and this is really, really important, is the situation is described as an emergency and an identifiable action can be taken. Some of you may know about the tragedy of the commons. It was first described by English economist William Foster Lloyd, in which individuals used a shared common resource. In this case, it was pasture, but you can certainly think of climate, our skies and our waters. Those people act independently only in their personal interest, contrary to the common good, and in doing so end up, because of their actions, using up or spoiling that resource. Why are some of us reluctant to discuss climate change with friends? When we're with people who want to deny or disconnect, our words can mess up the mood. Our society rewards good moods, not climate Debbie Downers. I can shut down and have a dinner party just by mentioning something about climate. Less so now, but in the past there'd be a dead silence. And once a neighbor of mine once said to me as I was walking into a holiday party, this is a couple of years ago, don't bring up climate either. She may have said right away, I don't know, but I think I waited a few minutes. Messaging. How do we influence people ethically to take action? This is important. Expert on persuasion, Bob Cialdini, has researched 7 ethical principles of persuasion. I'll let you look those up or read the text later, just so that we have a little more time. But we don't have to choose between doom and gloom and sugarcoating reality. We can reach most people with that 2-step process that incorporates both, funnels us from being a bystander into becoming an upstander. With step 1, getting people's attention. It's got to be dangerous. Otherwise, it's not going to break through the noise. There's too much other stuff going on. And then we have to pivot to, here's what we can do about it. Humans are highly suggestible creatures. This is additional work of Cialdini's, but many other social psychologists, and it emphasizes the power of social norms. Cialdini reports that people will say they take action for the planet because, in this order, it benefits society, helps save the environment, saves money, and last, because other people are doing it. That's what we self-report, except that it's just the opposite. Most people are affected because of what they see other people are doing. And as you can see, twice as high as saving money. And last, unbelievably, is that it benefits society. We're not as altruistic in studies that really show our behaviors as we would like to think. So let's move on to part 3, the most important part. I would like to have you particularly pay attention to this and to come back to the question that I asked earlier as I have a quick look at our time. And that is to ask you, circling back to that question on ethics, where does that ethical behavior, that ethical roadmap calling for action on climate come from? How do we source it? How do we look at it in this time of crisis? Is it obeying the law? If not, does it mean that under some circumstances we should break the law? Is it following the precepts of religion, responding to the mores of society, including our professional norms? Of course, laws, religion, and society embrace ethical standards. We also know that in the name of each, many injustices and even abhorrent behaviors have been considered ethical. We also know that what we say we should do and what we actually do can be 2 different things. What should guide us in our efforts to stop climate change? A Talmudic equivalent of Aesop's fables goes like this, and I'm taking some liberties, but it really motivates me, and it really has me understanding on a very profound level how to look at this. A non-Jew comes before a famous Jewish scholar and confronts him. I will convert, he says, on condition that you teach me the whole Torah while standing on 1 foot. The scholar looks thoughtful a moment and then answers, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. So what would hurt us, we must not do to others. An unerring moral compass is simply that it is wrong to hurt others. The only ethical position that honestly shows we have a moral compass now is action on climate. We have a duty to warn and protect those who are in harm's way. And it is grounded in our professional organizations, the American Medical Association, the Nurses Association, our mental health, the APAs, psychiatric, psychological, social workers. It's grounded in legal issues, English common law, French law, both of which require us to respond to people who are in grave danger. It's grounded in ecocide, a law that we hope is going to join the 4 other crimes that are prosecutable in the International Criminal Court. We also, and this is something which we need to consider, and I've been pushing on my colleagues, we have a duty to warn and protect that it's grounded in laws about child abuse. All 50 states have laws making it mandatory for mental health professionals to report even the suspicion of child abuse. In some parts of the world, this includes any vulnerable person. Any act or failure to act resulting in actual or potential harm can qualify. Child protection laws, child advocacy groups, and health organizations identify child abuse, among others, as injury from physical and emotional harm, from neglect, abandonment, from living under conditions that are injurious to well-being. Mandatory reporting of child abuse is a legal obligation, but it is also a moral one. As we consider the magnitude of the physical and emotional harm coming to us, especially the cumulative toll to young people, it should be clear that deliberate neglect by inaction or insufficient action on climate occurring with full knowledge of the consequences renders this professional opinion a straightforward, if difficult one to make. The aggression against children who are already suffering deeply must be called what it is, a form of child abuse. I won't go through all the major religions, but every major religion of the world calls upon us to be good stewards, and in some cases specifically calls out climate action. So, what are we called to do? I call it the 3 Ps, sometimes 4 Ps. I know that everyone on this call is already a dedicated climate activist, so I won't belabor something that you're already doing. But personal, I like to say, start with doing your own carbon footprint. It keeps you honest. It shows you what's hard to do. It shows you what you can do that's easy. It makes us humble. It also makes us courageous. Professionally, all the people we work with, and all the people that we can motivate by our actions, calling out if we work in companies, upstream issues that we can address, and of course, political. We know that either participating in elections, going door to door, contributing money, running for office ourselves, these are all ways that we can affect upstream policies that have such powerful downstream effects. And let me just take one more little indulgence. These will be linked. You can see them. I've already got them on links right now, but here are 10 of my favorite success stories, all the great things that are already happening. This is what used to be a garbage dump in Bolivia. It was, let me show you what it was. Oh gosh, look at this. Now it has turned into a verdant area because a half a dozen women there it is, got together and decided that they were going to change the way where they were given this area to live in, and they decided they would do what it took to change things. I'm going to move to a different one.
I think the screen is a little black, it's not showing anything. I'm not sure if.
Okay. I will then, let me go back to, I thought that I would be able to link to that, but I obviously was not. I will go back to our PSR ambassadors.
Yeah,
So,
and while you're doing that, we'll
there you go.
extra time for questions.
Okay.
after Lisa
The
finishes.
Ethiopian church forests, Costa Rica now powered entirely now by renewable energy for almost 300 days. Look at them all. And my favorite, when wolves change rivers. So have a look at these. They will inspire you despite all of the problematic things we've heard. It's ordinary people have made these things happen. So I'm happy to take your questions. I just want to say that things take longer to change than we ever think they are going to, and then they can change faster than we ever could have imagined. So keep that in mind. We can do this, but we have to be smart, we have to be together, and we have to hurry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Van Susteren. That was great. I will just try to man the chat and questions if people want to raise their hands or type in the chat. And we'll stay on for a little while for questions. Thank you for being such a great audience.
Well, I will say something that I left out. I was leaving out things as we went along if I didn't think it was absolutely critical. But one thing I would like to say is some of the ways in which we express our denial. And one of them is intellectualization. And I know that I and others are guilty of this, and that is doing research for research's sake, when we don't really need sometimes to know more. What we need to do is take what we already know and turn it into what we do. A friend of mine has referred to some of this research himself, a researcher on coral reefs, and says what some of us are doing right now is like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic to get a better view. So now it's action.
Susan?
Yes, thank you so much for this presentation. I am wondering if you could comment on how we talk to children and youth about climate change.
Yes, and I will direct you to my good buddy, Harriet Sugarman, who has written a book on this, and there are other sources as well, but it depends on the child's age. And I'm not sure if I can still remember the ABCs, but I once listed it as the ABCs of talking to children. And the first thing is, as I said, their age. So if it's a little kid, you're going to talk differently than if it's a teenager. And so that's really important to consider. The B was the behaviors that your child is already exhibiting. Is this an indoor kid, an outdoor kid? Is this a kid that's already stressed? Is this a kid that wants to go out there and flex his muscle? And then the conditions that kids have been in. What types of settings have they lived in? Have they seen extreme weather events? Are they exposed to chronic climate conditions, et cetera? So those are all issues to consider as you go about figuring out how to talk to kids. And I could go at much greater length, but I also refer to as the 3 L's. Listen to what your kids have to say. Learn. If you are hearing things you don't know anything about, tell them you're going to learn more, and then leverage that into action.
That was a great question. Any other questions? We still have time. You can type in the chat. And Lisa, do you want to put maybe your email in the chat or some way
Oh
for?
gosh, please do. Yes, it's very easy to remember. It's just my initials, LVS, Lisa, V, Victor, S, Sam, and the number 350 at me.com.
lvs350@me.com. So we do have some more questions. Linda
Yeah.
asked, could you please comment on the interaction of climate change with other stressors that impact mental health and well-being, like poverty, built environment, etc.?
That is certainly a massive question to answer. What I can say is that climate change exacerbates every other social ill, whether it's racism, poverty, all of the injustices of climate make every other injustice worse.
Mm-hmm. And then another question from Adriana about cognitive dissonance, how to know what/how much to say or withhold in order to mobilize consensus, ingenuity, and agency on any given issue among colleagues, allies, and workplace who may not normally have access to the same level of information or transparency.
Yeah, that's another, I mean, all these are great questions, and I will have a book out soon. It's going to actually be a website so that it's free, not behind any paywalls. You can look at it, and it will include a whole section on how to talk to deniers. And especially what it does is it can show us how we shape our message to liberals, progressives, versus conservatives. And a lot of what I've said in this particular presentation would not be what I would say to a conservative audience. Conservative audiences generally like to hear about system justification. They like to hear about themes of patriotism. They like to hear about protecting their families, the people around them. They like to talk about all of the issues that remind them often of strength and a unity and coalition that fosters an enhancement of the beliefs. Progressives don't mind getting into an argument about the details. And there's a lot of neuroscience behind this. I'm not dreaming it up, but I would be delighted to either be asked specifically for that information or else stay tuned for the book or the website.
Thank you. And I can also disseminate that information once it's out. Another question from Cynthia. I don't know, Mitchell, if you were saying
Yeah,
something.
Becca, I have a question, but I
Yeah.
can wait.
No, if you want to go for it, and then we can do Cynthia's question.
Okay, sure. First of all, thank you for your talk. I had a question that kind of went back to one of the ones you were answering earlier about just I think about the intellectualization of these issues. And so I'm a medical student, and one of the things that I've been working on is creating curriculum at my local medical school and then more broadly regionally to educate future doctors about these issues. And I was kind of wondering like what sort of a balance you see in terms of like what level of information do you think the average health professional needs to know about these topics? And do you see any issues in maybe over educating people, providing too many details, which kind of distracts from I guess talking too much about problems and not enough about solutions, if that makes sense?
Yes, of course. And it used to be that we needed to talk more about the problem because people were oblivious, but Mother Nature has now made that point. So I think we don't have to talk so much about the problem. I think we have to, whenever we're working with people, we have to get them of a mind to consider what's being said. So I went quickly through the dramatic extreme weather events because you need to pull people's minds away from whatever else they were thinking and get them to focus. You've got to break through the noise. So for a curriculum, of course, depending on how much time you have, do you have an hour? Do you have 6 weeks, 6 months? How much time you got every year? I will say that yours is a fabulous effort, and the more you can do, the better. I think that it is often said that people who don't understand the science may respond initially to our urging to take certain actions, but if they don't understand the science and functioning at a high level, that they won't, it won't be sustained behavior change. They've got to understand why. So that's imperative. But all of this depends on your audience, and every audience is different. What they need to hear is different, but what you're doing is an evolving process, and you will see what works best, I believe, given the particular conditions that you find yourself in. But hats off to you for doing this. Please get in touch. I'd love to communicate with you about it.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for your talk.
I hope nobody minds the audio track. I thought I had this wired where my little furry friends were going to not be members of this audience, but as it turns out, they were.
Well, I love pets, so I love seeing people's pets in Zoom. Okay, I'm gonna go back to Cynthia's question, and then we have one other. It's about the role. What about the role of disinformation and power fighting awareness and action? That's another big topic.
Well, it's obviously hugely problematic because we all want to believe, there was that the magic parent, Deus Ex Machina, is going to show up and that's going to fix everything. And no one, society does not reward Debbie Downers. We want to hear people with that can-do sort of feeling. Well, that's important to consider. I'd ended on success stories. I was hoping to bring you some images so that you would feel that momentum. But it is absolutely critical that we combat that wish only to see the positive and hear the positive by embedding success stories and intertwining them in our message about the problem. There's the two-step issue. Tell it like it is, segue to here's what we can do about it. People do not want to feel vulnerable. And I have often said that as a psychiatrist, as a therapist, all these years, you're not going to have patients coming back. If they come in, you pull their pants down, they feel more vulnerable than ever. And then it's critical that before they walk out of the office, you start telling them all the good stuff that they can do to feel better, so that when they walk out, they say, I'm glad I came. So they've got to, when they leave your talk, they've got to say, maybe that it was hard to hear, but they're glad they came, because they understand that the energy of their emotions it's critical to know what we feel, because otherwise we're not going to direct it in any sustained way into action. That message has to get through. It's like, who's going to take chemotherapy if you say, well, you have a very, you have cancer, but, let's check it again in 6 months. You've got to say it's aggressive. We've got to say it's really a problem. We've got to treat this. And then you've got to give them certain protocols. This is how you get people to take action in ways that may not be necessarily what they would do otherwise. Some people will just follow the advice given, and that's the end of the story. But don't forget, again, this herd mentality. I wanted to also to have you look at this following. You've got to look at this. This is The Lone Dancer, and it is all about capturing the herd mentality. I didn't want to take up the time to play it for you, and I'm not going to do a spoiler alert, but do me a favor, go to YouTube and type in Lone Dancer and see what happens with social norms. See what happens when one person takes action and that action is sustained, and how that affects us. We are members of society. We're a herd mentality, and it's a survival strategy to keep in the in group. If we're out there alone, we're much more vulnerable. Herd mentality. No one's blowing smoke in each other's faces anymore. We're all buckling up, practicing safe sex, more or less, I presume or hope. Those are not things that happened, a few decades ago. It's now unquestioned. Everybody sort of does it the right way. There are exceptions, of course, but don't forget social pressures.
That's great. I'm trying to find the video. I just want to read one more question from Kim, which is a great one that I think about. Even though I've been active in climate and environmental organizations for years, I still struggle with finding answers to what we can do, short of global action to stop business as usual, which most people can't afford to do due to their struggle to survive in an unequal world. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I sure do. And too much quoted, I suppose, is it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think for many climate activists, there's a feeling, and I know it's true of me, is that we have rescue fantasies. We really want to do something defining, but that's not how climate change, that's not how culture works. Culture is really the combination of individual actions. Just like votes on election day, people will say, well, what one person does doesn't matter. But yes, it does, because all of our individual actions are counted collectively. And it's that collective voice that yields the outcome of elections and drives policy. So do not underestimate anything you do. What we do influences our families, our friends, our neighbors, and don't be afraid to be a burr under people's saddle. Make sure that people know what you're doing. I take the train unless I have no other choice, and even on long distances. And I say no. I took the train very broadly to people to make sure. And I know they've all taken airplane rides, and I'm not judging other people, but there's one group that I know. Look at Davos, all these rich guys and women perhaps flying in on private airplanes, and Greta Thunberg sat there and chewed them out for it. These are the kinds of things that we need to call out. And that is that we, by our own example, can influence people, and those collective actions drive markets. They change the outcome of elections. They influence others. And remember, not everything counts, can be counted. So even if your actions, you don't see the impact, they cause ripple effects. And indeed, this is back to the intellectualization. Not everything that is counted counts. So, now 37.4 versus 42.5, et cetera. And we spend how many thousands of dollars to do the study? Does it matter? Is it going to change outcome? If it's just a study for study's sake, don't do it, and call into question others who might not be recognizing how much we all engage in intellectualization.
That's a great answer. Any other questions? I actually have a question, unless someone else has one. I want to leave time. It's kind of on the topic of what you were saying about also being an active disruptor amidst your families and friends, and that's something that's always on my mind. What do you think? I know it depends on the circumstance and who you're talking to. What do you find is a useful way to bring up the climate crisis and bring up action and motivate people in a way that doesn't make them just like turn away and feel demotivated?
All right. I'm not saying I always succeed at that. I don't. I have my portable 2x4 that I carry with me. Ideally, it's the same as it is when we approach children who are not engaged in, approach children with uncomfortable topics. And that is that if we ask an open-ended question, perhaps suggesting our own concern about conditions, and then fall back and listen to what people have to say, give people a chance to talk, which is what I don't do. And I have to remind myself, it's funny, in my practice, I do it all the time, but as a climate activist, I don't always follow my own rules, and I shouldn't admit that, but it is hard. But it is really important for people's voices to feel valued. If they feel important, then they are much more likely to listen to you, to trust you, and to be influenced by you if they like you. That's just simply one of the factors in persuasion is likability. And if you're listening to them and nodding when they're speaking, they're going to be more apt to follow along in reasoning that you have about, maybe you use the word stewardship, restoring the beauty and the bounty of nature. You don't have to necessarily, depending upon the audience, mention climate. It's a buzzword for some people. Maybe you want to mention the mental health of kids and say that you are concerned about their fears about things, etc. So sometimes the indirect approach, as I say, is best or better than a direct one. Obviously, in a presentation like this, it's expected that I'm not going to beat around the bush, but I have a tendency not to anyway.
Thank you so much. All right. So it is 3:16 my time. Thank you so much for your time. Really fabulous presentation. I will be sending out a recording to everyone, and also Lisa's email for you to get in touch. And thank you so much for everyone for being such an active and wonderful audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take good care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.